Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramesar, and as we sit here on the eve of the budget, we are indeed privileged once again to have Mr. Subhas Ramkhelawan, who is the founder and managing director of Bourse Securities, on the program. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Very, very kind of you to be here, and of course I can think of no better person as we contemplate what the budget may bring to talk to. How much wiggle room exactly do we have as regards this budget?
Well, as we have spoken about before, there's very little wiggle room in terms of revenue adjustment or even expenditure. When we spoke to expenditure the last time I was on your set, we spoke about the very sparse elbow room for social programs in terms of cutting those. We spoke also about some opportunities that may be there in terms of the state enterprises, adjusting the state enterprises. But transfers and subsidies, which is about 57% of the overall expenditure in the past 10 months or the first 10 months of the budget, there's not much room to adjust in revenues, and in terms of expenditure, not much as well. So there are other avenues that the Honorable Minister of Finance will have to pursue, and the question is what will be the mix of the revenue of the measures in order to try to close whatever gap depending on what he sets as the expenditure target.
Now, of course, one of those areas will be taxes.
Yes.
People are looking very closely at taxes. There is a danger, and it's very much a balancing act, isn't it? If you raise taxes too much, you can really stall the economy even worse than it already is stalled.
Yes. And therefore, I don't think that taxes will be a big part of the equation in terms of seeking to adjust. Because what you don't want to do, as you rightly said, is stall the economy or put it into further precipitous decline. So he has to find ways keeping expenditure up, so to keep the economy going on the one hand, but finding ways to close the fiscal gap. Because if he keeps expenditure up, if you take out, for example, the payment of the back pay to the public sector, the adjusted expenditure for 2016 would have been in the order of about $54 billion. Now, what does he need to do to, in a situation where revenues have fallen off? Because what we have seen, and I can tell you, as at the 9-month period, October to June 2016, what we have seen is that total revenue budgeted to be about $40 billion on a smoothed basis for that 9-month period over the entire year is in fact $30 billion. So there is already a 25% shortfall as far as revenues are concerned. And this has been brought about because of the precipitous decline in the tax take from the energy sector. And let me put it this way to you. In 2015, the tax take from the revenue sector was about $28 billion of the $60-odd billion. In 2015, that fell away to about $18 billion. In this year, the 10-month period to the end of July, it is down to $5 billion. So see how significant that fall is, and the energy sector being a significant contributor to the purse of the government or the country.
Now, that shortfall, is that because of declining production, energy prices, or is it because of tax holidays, or is it a combination of all of them?
It's a combination. The fall off in volume, as we mentioned the last time, both in terms of oil production as well as in terms of gas production, one. Two, there is the question of tax, the supplemental tax on oil. Once oil price falls below $50 or thereabouts, there is no take in terms of supplemental tax, because this is the threshold with regard to what's happening in the area. And then thirdly, there was the whole question of the accelerated allowances to encourage exploration in the oil and gas sector, particularly the gas sector, which means that you can expense all of your capital expenditure in the current year. And that would, of course, reduce the profits of the gas the explorers, and it will reduce the tax of this. And that is the main contributor, or those are the main contributors to the fall off.
Now, we've seen some news as relates to that recently. Of course, we have the most recent development, which was the OPEC agreement to curtail production. But there's also been some talk of the fact that there may be a crash coming in the cost of natural gas in the next year or two as a result of new sources coming on stream. Is that something that the finance minister should be taking into account as he looks forward?
Well, there are a number of things that he would need to take into account as he looks forward to, in terms of the energy sector. The first is that he needs to get a ramp up gas production, and I think that is on the cards at least for the next year or two, to get gas production up to where it was in 2014 or thereabouts.
Well, I think you said last time that even if Juniper comes on, we'll still be below our peak production.
What I said is that even if Juniper comes on and we increase our gas production by 1 billion standard cubic feet per day, that is a gross figure. What is happening is there's depletion in other areas, so the net incremental increase will fall away over the next 2 years very quickly, unless in the medium term we can actually find and add to our reserves of gas. So his challenges, or our challenges as a nation, is how do we make up this gap and who is going to bear the burden. So it's not a question of hard choices, it's a question of what will be the mix of these hard choices. And essentially, as we've talked about revenue ramping down, and we've talked about expenditure being sticky downwards, it means that the gap will indeed be significant and will have to be closed. Now, what are his choices? Well, there are from a menu, there are about 5 things to choose from apart from the revenue expenditure conundrum. One is, how does he treat with divestment of state assets? 2, how does he draw down on the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and to what extent? 3, how does he move forward in terms of borrowing, and where and how can he borrow? 4, how does he treat with the collection of loans made, particularly to CLICO, and as well as drawing back on the loans made to TGU? And 5, how does he address the question of a clear policy on currency, which can in fact have an impact on the fiscal side? So if we take all of those things, divestment, well, he can continue to do a further divestment of FCB, and that was in discussions, a further 20%. He can also make some adjustments with regard to divesting NEL. Those are the 2 major plays that are there. Government owns directly and indirectly about 83% of NEL, and therefore NEL at current prices of $10, 600 million shares out there, there is the opportunity to do some sort of divestment. So how does he treat with that? Then the question of what does he do with the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Last time we talked about the Honorable Prime Minister making a statement that over 2016 and 17 he would want to draw from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund about $1.5 billion. Only $375 million US dollars I'm speaking about has been drawn. So he does have in his war chest, if you want to call it that, he does have about 1.125 billion that he can draw on. When he draws, it generates 2 benefits. One is that it helps him to close the gap between revenue and expenditure, but 2, this is then transferred to the reserve, and it will help to keep the balance of payments equation in better order. Now we have said, it has been said, that our reserves have remained fairly stable, but that is because even though exports are falling and imports are sticky downwards, we would have had 1 billion in borrowings, US dollars, which would have fed into the reserves because much of that was brought in to pay TT dollar expenses. And the second thing is we would have had that 375 million US dollars drawdown on the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which will also contribute to the reserves. So, borrowing now. Let's talk about borrowing. Well, we have to be rather careful about borrowing, because if we borrow beyond certain limits, one, our credit rating will drop, and then our cost of borrowing will increase.
And it's already dropped.
It has dropped, but it could drop further with the current situation that we are in. So the Honourable Minister has to be careful about how much he can borrow. The other factor with regard to borrowing is that there has been a self-imposed limit by government that it would not want to borrow beyond a certain ratio that the credit rating agencies look at in terms of determination of downgrading, one of the ratios, which is that the debt to GDP should not go beyond 65%. I must say at this point in time, the debt to GDP, as GDP is declining and debt is increasing, the debt to the GDP is in the order of about 57 or 58%. Now, nominal GDP is about $165 billion. And what is happening is that he does not have much headroom to borrow. If you were to borrow $7 or $8 billion, TT equivalent, that will take him up to the 65%.
And he may need a little bit of wiggle room in the future.
Right.
If
So
things get more
2017, that's what I'm speaking about in terms of the menu. How does he draw from the menu to get the best balance and the trade-off between shooting the economy in the foot on the one hand, but the burden of adjustment, how it is spread across the frame. So we've talked about divestment, we've talked about borrowing,
And the HSF.
and we've talked about the HSF. Now, let us talk about the collection of loans made by the government. The 800-pound gorilla in the room is in fact CLICO CL. There has not been a final determination of what is the extent of debt by CLICO CL to the government of Trinidad and Tobago. We have heard 20 billion, we have heard 24 billion. What exactly is it that has to be repaid, and how is it going to be repaid? The Honourable Minister in his first budget statement spoke to being able to extract as much as possible of the repayment in the first year. Of course, that will be embroiled in possible legal matters as the shareholders of CLICO look to see how their position is being secured or ring-fenced. And so the question of timing of the repayment is at issue. It is not as clean and clinical that we can in fact get the repayment in this year.
We can't even quantify it at this point because we don't know what the actual
it
balance
is not fully quantified, let us put it that way. If it is 20 billion or 25 billion, that's a big difference. And then the other player that the government that they would have drawn down on was a repayment by Trinidad Generation Unlimited, or TGU. I think the intent under the last administration was to secure repayment in the amount of about $600 million. And I would have mentioned the last time, I think about 250 to 300 million US dollars has been repaid. So those are the kinds of areas that we can draw down on. Now, the most sensitive area, which is point 5 or menu of number 5 on the menu,
Currency.
is currency. Now, there are those who argue that if we adjust if we allow the currency to arrive at its market exchange rate, the main persons who would suffer are our citizens at the lower end of the income scale. There is a counter argument that we are going to get there anyhow. And who are the winners and losers in terms of having an official rate that is veering away from what the unofficial rate is? Because those who can't get in the official market have to go to the so-called black market.
And they're paying about $7.50 is what I gather.
Yes,
in many
about
cases.
$7.50. In fact, this morning I heard that the rate had actually gone up to about $8 in that particular market. But I cannot quantify, I cannot verify that, except that I've
That's
heard
the nature of the black market.
from certain players. Now, as we keep the currency at an artificial rate, the winners are those people who are getting their currency via the official market. They are getting it in the official market. But what is happening is that in terms of pricing and reselling goods and services, implicitly what is happening is that it is being marked at the 750 level. Meaning, I get currency at 675, but when I'm selling and I'm looking for what the margins are, I'm using 750 as my marker to determine what the pricing will be and so on.
So by propping up the currency with a dirty float as we have it, the government is essentially, well, central bank is essentially subsidizing those people who have access to the official rate currency.
That is the argument. That is the argument, that as long as you do that, there are winners. And the winners would be, though not those people in the low income grouping, but the winners would be many of the traders who might be utilizing and accessing currency, because the framework is that those who are importing goods will get first call on the currency. And so that is part of the challenge. Even the personal side, those persons who have a credit card with a US dollar limit, they will be accessing at the official exchange rate. That does not include the lower income grouping. So you have essentially put yourself in a position that you have to address this question from a policy perspective. How do we create the balance, share the burden, and be equitable in the distribution and the rate of currency? Now, if you adjust the currency, it comes to the coffers of the Treasury in the conversion to TT dollars. So you'll get more TT dollars. Mm-hmm. So that is one area that is rather sensitive, but has to be and needs to be put into the mix and addressed properly. Because what we are doing is we are essentially masking in the argument that, okay, our reserves have remained stable, but our reserves are remaining stable because one of the drawdown in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, feeding the US into the reserves and converting that to TT to make TT dollar payments, and the borrowing in US dollars, feeding that into the reserves and converting to TT to make TT dollar payments. So that's the mix. How does he now get that balance is very important. I have argued that it would be, again, shooting ourselves in the foot if we make too many adjustments to the fuel subsidy, because we are already level pegging in super, and we are also, I think those people who are buying premium are actually subsidizing the state, because at the pump, if you look at it, at the pump we are paying more than what the market price
so it's
should
really
be.
diesel we're talking about.
So it's only diesel, and so far the subsidization of energy of gas has been about $1.5 billion. So we cannot afford, if we want to send a message, and the message is let us increase, let us reduce the subsidy, I would say it cannot be all at one time as far as diesel is concerned, because we've argued already that the lower income grouping will be the grouping that will suffer the most in terms of transportation and other add-on and indirect add-ons. Here are your 5.
Right.
This is your menu. Choose from it.
Now, in terms of, as a master of the markets as you are, when a country is faced with a sort of deficit situation that we have in terms of revenue versus expenditure, is it best to try and use an axe-like approach to just fix everything as quickly as possible and wait for the fallout to sort of clear? Or is it best to sort of gradually ease in to try and reduce revenue, expenditures, for example? Like,
well,
would we be expecting a massive drop in the expenditures for this next budget?
Well, I think that what you have seen is that there has in fact been a massive drop in terms of expenditure. As I mentioned to you, capital expenditure, which on a smoothed basis should have been in the order of about $5.25 billion at the end of the first 3 quarters, is in fact $1.9 billion. And therefore, in a sense, what is happening government as a spender, as an investor, is cut back on that, and that is going to have multiplier effects in terms of the economy. As you drop the infrastructural expenditure, it means that more jobs will be lost. It means that the construction sector will feel that burden the heaviest, and the construction sector is, of course, one of the primary indicators as to where the economy is going or not going.
And I guess that's one of the problems with people who are sort of really free marketers
Yes.
and look to the US as a prime example. That's a fundamentally different economy. The
Yes.
government is not the biggest driver of the economy in
That's
the US,
right.
it's consumption.
Yes,
As a small state, the government does very much drive the economy, doesn't it?
it does. And it's the largest collector of US dollars. It is not as though we have many industries that contribute to generation of export US dollar inflows. It is mainly the energy sector. So if we had a burgeoning tourism industry, we might get it from that. If we had other sectors working well and contributing significantly to the national economy, then you would have generated income from that. As it is now, it is government that can decide when and how to turn on the tap through its collaboration with the central bank. And therefore, that's a good thing, and it's also a bad thing. It's a good thing because you can manage the flow, and it's a bad thing because there are not a whole set of generators of US dollars, and therefore, if you take an economy like Jamaica, in the Jamaican situation, you can get currency whenever you want. Their reserves are not as high as us, but there are a whole number of flows taking place in the economy and a large number of sellers and buyers. We have very few sellers when you have to make up the gap between what the banks are getting into their coffers and what needs to be put in by the central bank. And the central bank has cut back on what it is putting into the system, and that is what is causing the crunch.
We have about 2 minutes left. In terms of people who are, as a general rule, pessimistic, are we looking at in any way towards a late 1980s scenario developing in our economy here in Trinidad and Tobago?
I think we have more clothes on our back this time than the last time around. We have more clothes on our back because we have the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. We will have to draw very sagaciously from that one. And our debt ratios are still reasonably manageable. Once we start getting beyond 65 and 75 and so on, then we will have an issue. So many of the metrics that an outside player will look at are in still reasonably good order, but we are at the edge of a situation, and how we maneuver ourselves along that edge and away from that edge is the most critical factor that we will look at as this budget is unfolded.
So basically, we're looking at the finance minister to see whether he puts measures in place to ensure that things start perhaps moving in an upward direction in terms of buoyancy in the economy, or if he lacks, if you will, the courage to take the necessary measures if we start going downhill further.
Well, he has to decide what is the regime in the gas sector. What is he's going to do? Is he going to continue to allow 100% accelerated allowances, or is he going to find some sort of middle ground? Because it cannot be that we are promoting exploration, but at the same time, the government needs income to continue to support its own program by way of taxes. So he has to decide what he's going to do with that particular area. He's going to have to decide what he's going to do with all of those state enterprises where there is double counting of employment. He has already made some indication about how he's going to deal with some of the make work programs. I want to see how deeply he will cut that, because if he cuts that, it affects employment at the lower income level. So if
Which
the
can
more
destabilize society to some extent.
the more you do of that, the more challenging it becomes for those who are the most dependent, if you will, on the state.
Well, Subhas Ramkhelawan of Bourse Securities, it's been a tremendous pleasure having you in the program, and let's see what happens Friday afternoon. Thank
Good.
you so much for being here.
Okay,
Thank you very much. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.